All throughout the story of Mark's gospel, Jesus has had clarity about his purpose and about his mission, even when everybody else around him has had a different agenda or cookie-cutter mold for him to fit in. Jesus has known he's been headed toward laying down his life on a cross, and when that moves from being an abstract, hypothetical, maybe down the road kind of thing to being very real and very tangible, Jesus doesn't flinch. That's where we're headed in this conversation on meeting Jesus. So last time we took a look at the beginning of Mark chapter 14 as we set the stage for Jesus sharing one last Passover meal with his disciples. And sort of the table was set as we got to last time's conversation. But I want to start there with the story of what happens at the table in Mark chapter 14, verses 22 and following. Remember, this is the Passover meal. This is the ritualized central festival of ancient Jewish life that had been around for more than 1,000 years. And the meaning was clear. Going back to the commandments in the Torah, the bread, this unleavened bread, was to help the people remember when they had been slaves in Egypt and they wouldn't even have time to wait for their bread dough to rise. So God says, make unleavened bread because when I set you free, you're going to go out so fast you won't even have time for the bread to rise. And they had lamb whose blood goes on the doorpost so that everybody inside the house knows we're safe. God will see the blood on the lamb. Of the lamb on the doorpost and will be kept safe inside. And eventually the tradition came to include wine on the table that in some ways would have represented the sweetness of making it eventually to the promised land. So there Jesus is at the table. They've had their ritual Passover meal, Jesus and his found family of disciples and apprentices. And with the meal that's there on the table, when they've gone through the official ritual they've learned over 1,000 more plus years of history that's been handed down to them, Jesus takes these same elements on the table and takes the bread and goes, I know that all your lives you've been told this bread is about being set free from slavery. I'm now telling you, take this bread, this is my body. Jesus takes the cup and goes, this cup is my blood poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins. Jesus is doing something audacious, something any rabbi would know not to do, right? This takes 1,000 years of religious history and goes, I know you all thought it was this. I know this is what you've been told. I'm now giving it new meaning. You only do that if you actually have the authority of someone like, God, to give new meaning to these ancient rituals and symbols of Judaism. Jesus is claiming something even more definitive than the Passover, than the Exodus, is happening in his life and in his laying down his life on the cross in just a matter of hours or a day. This is a pretty big deal. This is part of why the Christian community says that Jesus, his death and resurrection, is a new fundamental turning point. It's like a Passover for the whole universe as God sets us free, not just from a tyrant like Pharaoh, but from the power of death itself. This is a big deal. Jesus is infusing his own coming death with that kind of meaning. And it's worth understanding just what a big deal this is. Now, once that moment is over, his disciples are still probably scratching their heads because Jesus has just blown their minds. And they go out to the Mount of Olives outside in a place where there's a garden outside of the city of Jerusalem. There's a place called Gethsemane. And Jesus goes and prays with some of his disciples. They keep falling asleep on him. He keeps warning them, please try and stay awake. And they all, one by one, fail him. What's interesting is that you get this tension in this next scene there in the garden. Jesus prays, Abba, calling out to God like Father, like Papa, like Dad. For you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want. In other words, Jesus isn't like marching happily to the cross going, it's going to be so much fun to die. But there's this sense of this is the way. This is the way God saves and redeems the world. Not by crushing God's enemies with an invading army, but with suffering and death. God laying down God's own life in Jesus. So here we get both this tension of Jesus, who is very much a very real human being, who does not like pain, does not want to go through the difficult thing, but is willing to do the difficult thing for the sake of saving the world, for the sake of being God's chosen Messiah, for the sake of this is how God's reign is accomplished. In other words, the same message we've heard from Jesus from the very, very beginning of Mark's gospel, the reign of God is at hand. This is what it looks like. The cross isn't a detour that gets us out of the way of the reign of God. This is what God's reign looks like, suffering love, This is what Jesus has also said to his disciples along the way, that his kind of greatness isn't what the world calls greatness, right? The world's big deals and so-and-sos and great ones and kings and tyrants, they lord it over their subjects or their enemies, and they try and destroy their enemies and exert power and domination over them. Jesus says this isn't how it is for us. God's way, my way, Jesus says, is that if you want to be great, you put yourself in the role of servant, even if that means laying down your life for your own. There in the garden then, while they've been there, Judas comes and has a gang of the religious leaders, the chief priests, the scribes, and a crowd with weapons, and they come to arrest Jesus. Now, as we've said, Jesus has known all along this is where the story is headed. Even when they were celebrating the Passover, sharing that meal together, Jesus says point blank to all of them, I know one of you is going to betray me, and he knows, presumably, who that is. Now, it's worth noting that means Jesus also fed Judas at the Last Supper. It means that in, say, the storytelling in John's gospel where Jesus washed his feet, Jesus washes Judas's feet as well. That welcome comes from Jesus. He's vulnerable that way. It doesn't let Judas off the hook. It doesn't mean that he doesn't bear responsibility for his choices, but that from Jesus' vantage point, Jesus never kicked Judas out. Jesus allowed Judas to make a terrible choice to leave. So there Judas comes back, armed with this sort of lynch mob of people who've come with weapons. And in one brief moment, one of Jesus' disciples thinks that now it's time to fight fire with fire. And the text says they laid hands on and arrested him, but one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. This is, in other words, they've come with weapons, so we got to fight back, Jesus. And Jesus makes it clear, this is not how my way works. Don't you understand? Have you not been paying attention? We don't respond to evil with more evil. We don't respond to violence with more violence. We don't respond to hatred with more hatred. Jesus responds to evil with good. And so he responds saying, this is not how we do things. And then says to the lynch mob, why have you come with weapons to come get me, right? I've been out in the open teaching in the temple every day, and now you chicken hearts come by night and arrest me like I'm a common criminal. From there, Jesus is taken and put on trial. And there's this tension where Simon Peter, who's been following along, sort of stands off outside, standing around the charcoal fire that they've made while they're putting Jesus on trial inside. Jesus is hanging out with the crowd that has sort of arrested Jesus. And hanging in the back of his ears is Jesus' warning that you'll deny even knowing me 3 times. And Peter had insisted, no, I promise, I'll never deny you. I'll go to death if need be. And they point out and they say, aren't you one of Jesus' followers? And he insists, no, I don't even know what you're talking about, Peter says. And then Jesus hears the rooster crow, or Peter hears the rooster crow and realizes Jesus knew that he was going to flake out, but that Jesus hasn't flaked out on him or any of them. The contrast is powerful. That Jesus remains faithful to his mission, to his understanding of the way of God, and to his disciples, even when they all fail him. That Jesus' kind of faithfulness isn't I'll be there for you if you're there for me. But Jesus' kind of faithfulness, I'll be there for you even when you bail out. I'll be there for you even when you deny even knowing me. I'll be there for you even when you resort to violence or think that the fighting fire with fire is the way to do things. Even when his disciples completely misunderstand, and even when they run away and abandon him to save their own skin, Jesus remains faithful to them, to the way of the cross, to the reign of God, even though that means Jesus knows this is about to get very, very difficult, very, very painful. It's worth noting then that in a sense, all of Jesus' life is what saves. All of Jesus' life, including his death and resurrection, are him constantly choosing to lay down his life, constantly choosing, I will walk in God's way. I will go this way of saving the world through suffering love, and to say no to all the other alternatives and options that were out there. All of Jesus' life has been a way of saying yes to the path of self-giving love and no to the ways of dominance, of violence, of saving your own skin and running away or bailing out on your friends. Jesus remains faithful even when everybody else abandons him. And ultimately, that's our hope as Christians, in a Jesus who remains faithful even when we blow it, even when we misunderstand, when we mischaracterize Jesus, misunderstand him, or try and turn him into our own personal mascot, even when we deny Jesus or bail out on him. His love doesn't let go of us. It's there, right there in the text of the 14th chapter of Mark's gospel. Jesus remains faithful even when everybody else falls away. That's where our conversation is headed this time on Meeting Jesus. We invite you, as always, join us for in-person conversation. We're doing this study on Thursdays at 1, so meet us this coming Thursday around the table here at Community of Christ, or you can keep catching up with these video summaries. We hope you join us either way as we continue Meeting Jesus.